The local history feature is brought to you by Gravity FM in association with Your Heritage, awarding funds from the National Lottery. See www.hlf.org.uk.
Ellys Manor House is a unique and magical Tudor wool merchant's house built in the Flemish style. It's an architectural gem. The main feature of the house is a fabulous scheme of early 16th century wall paintings. The house is a miracle of survival, remaining little altered through the intervening centuries and retaining many original features. The house is robust and imposing, with its dense stone walls and deep-set mullioned windows with shallow Tudor arches to throw off the rain. The ceilings are high throughout with huge oak beams. Some of the beams still have a good tincture of black and red ochre. The massive stone fireplaces would do most castles proud, and there is a sense of grandeur about the house. Great Ponton Church Tower soars high above the roof line of Ellys Manor House. You can appreciate the decorated battlements, the 8 pinnacles, and on top of one pinnacle sits the weather vane in the shape of a golden fiddle. I'm Ella Watts of Gravity FM. Join me as I visited Ellys Manor House and spoke to Clive Taylor. Clive is the current owner of Ellys Manor House, and I asked him, what is the Northern Renaissance?
The Northern Renaissance is not a term which is so commonly used now, but it's slowly coming back, and if I've got anything to do with it, we'll really know it's here to stay. And that's basically when the Renaissance left northern Italy and came to northern Europe. So what we see on this building, Ellys Manor House, are the step gables. Now the step gables are a symbol of northern Europe. All the way from Novgorod in Russia, all around the Baltic Sea, as the trade traveled through the Hanseatic League, we get culture and trade. We stayed Gothic in Northern Europe, thus this style of architecture. Here, this is a house we work very closely with in Sweden, Blimminghus. And so you see again the step gables. This is another house we're working with in Denmark. Even the cathedral in Warsaw, Poland, you see the step gables. So it is a feature of Northern Europe. You see it in France. Within the architectural language of this building, there are symbols of all of that travel. For instance, on the church tower, which was built by the man who built this house, there are a number of gargoyles. From the hallway, we can see 2 gargoyles looking towards us. The one to the left is quite possibly the earliest bespectacled gargoyle in the land. Now, one might think, gosh, bespectacles. But that has enormous significance, because we know the Arab world had spectacles long before Europe. Florence was the first place in Europe. And so we're seeing now the travel, bearing in mind that the man who built this house and the tower to the church was a wool merchant, a member of the Ellys family, an English wool merchant of the staple of Calais.
What is a staple?
The word staple, what does it mean? It's rather like a staple diet. It's used in a generic term, but within each discipline, it tells you that was the main trade. Now, if anyone's familiar with the Lincoln long wool sheep, they're very long wool. When you lift the wool and you put your hand against its body, what falls over it, that's considered the staple. Now, when they came about, they were hugely advantageous to weaving, because they didn't have to join the wool so frequently. So, all of these things are interwoven, pardon the pun, and, we individually get taught bits of these, and it might not seem related, but when the dots are all joined, suddenly it almost becomes a eureka moment. It's not just about culture, it's the whole of culture and trade, as a matter of fact. It's art, it's trade, you can see fashion, you can see painting, you can see economy. It's all there. The Ellys family. Now, the particular member which is credited to this, historically credited to this, is Anthony Ellis. If that's the case, because so murky is this, it could either have been Thomas, Anthony, or William. But whichever, they've left us a gem, an icon of a building, which tells us so much about our European heritage and how we interacted with each other. If you're able to read architecturally Ellys Manor House, you're able to read the whole of early European and British history, wrapped up in this building, showing itself visually. You know, wool is what saved England. The whole of the Cotswolds, Stamford, some of our finest churches, built from wool. You cannot mention the Constitution of England without the wool trade, which is why Lord Speaker sits on the wool sack. Now, we have posters in the corridor here, which has been sent to us from the Royal Library, and we see Henry VIII opening Parliament in 1523, when absolutely everyone in Parliament had to be seated on the wool sack, to show the pivotal role wool had played for the country. There was a time when they were uncertain if all of the wool, all of the sacks were genuinely filled with wool. So there was an act of Parliament to have these opened and checked. Wool was gathered from all around the Commonwealth, the Falklands and England. Now they know categorically. You can see all the measurements listed here. We have also other documentation as late as the 17th century, when there was another Act of Parliament. So important it was that we kept the trade going, that when you died you had to be shrouded in wool to be buried. And if you were found not to be, your family paid a tax of £5, which in the 17th century was a huge amount of money.
How much did it cost to put a wool covering on a body? At the time when you were being fined £5, how much did it cost you to actually do the correct thing?
You know, I don't know. That's a very intelligent question, and no one's ever asked me that. But we would like to use Ellys Manor House as a symbol, as an icon to all of this. And that's why we're so very determined to build our culture centre, not just for people to come in and wander about and say, oh, this is another old house, but to actually see people weaving, pottery, making all of these things that are desirable pieces that enhance our lives.
So what are we looking at a picture of here?
That's the Gutenberg workshop, because we have to remember, you see, after Luther went to Rome and blew the whistle on them, Catholicism had just lost the plot. He came back, and of course we're now moving in Northern Europe, we're moving into a different thing. People are starting, well, certainly the monks are, read and write, so they're printing. They were moving about much more than we think we did in days of old. Lincolnshire, our own very Lincolnshire, for instance, did more trade on the continent with Sweden than it did with the rest of the country, because it was much easier to go across the water than to go down the land. And we can see all of this if you look at the east coast of the country, all the way up to Scotland. Now there's a tiny town, there's a small town in Scotland on the east coast called Curos. It's spelled C-U-L-R-O-S-S, but the Scots pronounce it Curos. It's called the Little Bruges of Scotland, because all the houses have step gables. And 12 miles down the same coast, there's Dysart. They too have these step gables. We know that at Curos, they're descendants of De Bruce family. They used to trade coal to Norway, and so we're seeing the influence. Now in Norway, Finland and places like that, people aren't so aware of the step gables. But we have to remember that a lot of, if not most of the European capitals burnt down at some stage. And you know, that's how we differ greatly in England. We do not rebuild. There are occasions we restore, but mainly we conserve. But you know, what we do have in England, like Ellys Manor House, has its integrity. And I think that is what's terribly important. We are now drawing people up from the continent to come and see us, because we advertise on the continent. And just out of interest, sometimes when they come, I'll say to perhaps a Dane, Well, why do you come and see our wall paintings when you have the most, it's said, and finest painted churches? And someone might say to me, well, yes, we do, but we restore them. I like these here because they're real. They feel their age. Even in our local area, we see that enormous eye catch of Harloxton. Again, we can see Ellys Manor House wasn't the only building standing here with set gables, because old Harloxton, which was built by the De Ling family, and that tells you a Flemish name. This is someone kindly gave this to me. It's a little mock-up they had of the early Harloxton before it burnt down. And there you see all the step gables. And also Witham on the Hill, a Knights Templar site. And when you look at the list of all the Templars going off to the Crusades as early as that, you'd be amazed to see all the Flemish names. So this is something that's been going on for a long time, and we've got a pocket here. We can use this small building to reconnect ourselves with Europe and to tell them that Grantham is not only open, but it's open for trade. And that's
we could do with that. We could do with that.
We certainly could.
What's the significance of this shell?
Well, this is St. James, Santiago de Compostela, and this is the House of Shells at the end of the pilgrim's route. And here on this page, there's a pilgrim on his route, and these bridges, rather like pack bridges, a lot of them carries a scallop shell. That's to let the pilgrim know they're on the correct route. Now, they usually carry one about their person. It's said that irrespective of who they call on, they should afford them a scoop of sustenance. So it was also used in that way.
Did you say that this shell became a symbol that the Ellys family used?
It's in the Ellys family coat of arms. So this is why I refer to their arms as not arms but badges, because they're not chivalric. What you see are the scallop shells and the crescent shape. And then you see this is the Ellys' arms.
So 3 gold crescents and 3
scallops,
which are the signs of pilgrims. What is the impaled arms then?
Now, impaled, there are 2 terms, impaled or co-joined. What this basically tells us, his wife must have been an heiress for a female to have afforded that privilege. So she came with her own independence and wealth.
So they blend the coats of arms together?
Absolutely. They co-joined them together. Now we know that because she's from the Marshall family, and yes, that's Sir Ralph Marshall. They're a Nottinghamshire family. We have written to the archives, and so they sent us a list of reference numbers, so when we get some more help, these are things we can look into further.
Well, she's got 3 golden stars.
Yeah.
And what's the significance of that symbol there?
These are not easily recognizable. A fesque.
A fesque.
There was a much earlier building standing here, dated from about the 14th century. There is one wall that runs through this building that is said to be of that time, but the rest of it is late 15th, early 16th century. Now, that building would have been built, we have evidence, north-south, but the Ellys have come along and they've built this building as we see it, east-west. My theory, and this is my theory, I think they're doing what they've done always on the continent, and that is to show off the gable end to the public, as they do in Bruges, Ghent, the canals, the decorative side to the public. The situation we have here, the road which is colloquially called the High Dyke, which is what the gable end is addressing, is Ermine Street, one of the 4 Roman roads. And so that's where the fesque going up to Lincoln, Ermine, for the judges' scholars.
Is that why it was called Ermine Street?
Yes, because that's what travelled along there.
I suppose as a woman, you would have to have a lot of money to be acknowledged in those days.
Well, being an heiress, you see, she brought equal to the family.
When you said east to west, I thought you were going to say it was a Christian decision.
Well, again, you see, you have to take all of this into consideration, because it's never just one. They're always choices. So, but then when you're doing this, I'm sure you know, research and so forth, you have to take into consideration what were the main things of the day.
So where are we now? What do you call
we're
it?
standing in what's a hallway. Basically, you would have come through that front door into a hall. This is a partition, and so is that wall. Tudors didn't have corridors. There are two prominent dates, 1826 and 1921. Bearing in mind, these buildings, the way they look, fell out of favour. So there was a time when this became, in about 1826, this became two farm labourers' cottages. And we see other bits being done in 1921 when it became a rectory house. The Ellys family weren't here for an enormously long time. They've sped their way into the aristocracy. See, this is the achievement.
I don't understand the significance of that.
Right. Here you see the badge with the crescent on top, the crest. Now we're looking at the first baronet. He's gone up to top table.
Does everybody get a different crest? They do, don't they?
Yes, indeed. It's always pertinent to what your life is involved with.
So what does that one represent?
We see the knight's helmet, the wheat sheaf above. We see the crescents and we see the scallops being embellished by the knight's crest. They went on, this is a younger branch of the family, they went on to the magnificent old Nocton Hall, because the early hall there was absolutely fabulous. It was a gem of Lincolnshire. And this is a small drawing of it. Now the time we're dealing with, a branch of the Stanhope family were there, but they had no issue. So there was a marriage between Sir Thomas and Anne Stanhope. Sir Thomas's son Sir William inherited this at the age of 22. Not a bad inheritance.
It's not.
His son Sir Richard is said to have collected the largest, most important library in the land. These amassed to over 12,200 books, and I'm talking serious books. Now, they weren't collected at the house. They were collected at his Bolton Street home in Piccadilly, but brought to the house. Now, thankfully, they were saved, because there was a fire at this building in 1833. Nocton stands about 7 miles southeast of Lincoln City. But the inheritance came through his wife's family. Now, thankfully, as I said, the library was saved, and so the library went to Blickling in Norfolk.
Why did it go to Blickling?
You see, these are the marriages they made, which was very convenient. That took them up to top table. They were cousins. Now, at Blickling, the name is pronounced Hubbard, though it's spelled Hobart, but it's the same Hobart as the ex-penal colony in Tasmania. One of the Hobarts, or Hubbards, was an ambassador there, and it was named after him. In the Long Gallery, that's the Ellys Library, which is virtually intact today. Here we see the building, which one recognizes straight away. Now, there's a legend here that on an occasion a casket is sent from Calais to this building, not to be opened under any circumstance. It contains Calais sand. As the ships go one way with trade, the sand is used as ballast. On his return, they open this. In among the sand is said to be gold, and it's from that newfound wealth that gives us this enormous tower to church. The tower was finished being built in 1519. When that was built, John Leland was Henry VIII's chronicler of the day. He wrote in his diary, "Ellys is much risen by trade," and that followed them right through the generations. All of those badges which I showed you, this is how they appear in church, carved into the wall, where the tomb used to be. The tomb's no longer there. In days of old, you had what was called a visitation police. If you bore arms, they would come to your door to make sure you were the rightful owners, because even at that time, people walked around with arms that did not belong to them.
Identity theft.
Exactly. Nothing changes. And so that's how they can be precise, because those visitation were signed in. We're now looking at the tower. We can't actually see the bottom of it because of those yew hedge growing up there, but about a third up from the ground, decorating the tower on the outside. These are all the merchants' marks. There's about 35 or 36 of these.
And what's a merchant mark? That's their badge, is it?
Indeed. We see here as man in a boat. This is now the cog. The cog is a merchant ship. They were specifically designed for the merchants. There were ships before, but they were Norwegian. They were considered too long and narrow. There's a window at the top which hasn't got any glass panes. It's got louvers. Now the window below, that has a glass pane. Here you see Ellys, England, Hoddesdon. Now Hoddesdon, he too was a merchant of the staple of Calais, but he was also a mayor of Lincoln City. So he was certainly a man to know. And then beneath that you've got Ellys's motto, think ye and thank God of all. That's for his newfound wealth. You see the gargoyles looking towards us? The one to the left, that's the one that's quite possibly the earliest bespectacled gargoyle in the land. It has a quill, a ledger, and its rather generous spectacles. Now there is another quite extraordinary gargoyle, and that's a Christ figure in its classic pose, in Latin Salvati Mundi, and at the bare feet stage.
But that's Blessing Great Ponton.
Well, I like to think it's Blessing
Lovely.
We sent this one up to Rosslyn Chapel. They don't have a gargoyle there looking like this, but what they do have is way up in the eaves, they have the Christ figure, much the same as this. We go into this section, you can now see physically all of this was one. This fireplace, though it's absolutely enormous, you notice there's a new piece of stone also on the opposite side. So that's where the bressumer used to be.
No, what's a bressumer?
That would be like the large wooden or stone lintel that would go across the fireplace. The arch is actually a relief arch, because upstairs, sadly the room's in use so we can't get in there, but if you look on our website, Gallery 2, there's a good photograph of it. We have one of the largest stone hooded fireplaces you'll see. So that's to spread the load. We do have permission to scoop all this out back to the hall. And we intend to do this, but obviously our priority is getting this culture centre created. Then hopefully the revenue which that brings enables us to do this thoroughly. Because we can't just go ripping things about. We have to be very careful. Now this is interesting. Looking at this car, this photograph would have been taken from atop of the church tower in about 1928 or thereabout. Now this road, that's what became the A1.
That's the Great North Road.
That's a corner of the house there, and that's a massive weeping wych elm tree which used to stand on the south. Sadly, when we came, all there was an enormous stump. We got a machine in called a stump gobbler, scooped it all out below ground. Now we've put a deodara cedar in the exact position. So one day, aesthetically, we shall get that appearance back again. And that was the original Blue Horse pub. Here, this is what was sent to us from the Royal Library, and here we see Henry VIII in 1523. There you see they're all on the woolsack. And that continued right into Elizabeth I, but this is post-Reformation.
This is interesting here.
Indeed, this is when they were uncertain about all the sacks being filled with wool, so there was an Act of Parliament to have them opened and checked. This is when Church acquired this house in 1921 to be turned into a rectory house. You can see this is the hall in its entirety, and they've divided this up. So you came in, it's just a hall, and then the staircase go off a bit. And this is our lookout, a Tyrrell. So there were two windows looking to the north, which would also have lit the stairs with this other window. Now all of this was stone. This staircase as we see now came to us in the 17th century. When we get French visitors, we point this out to them. We say, look, it's not a slight on the French. It's get it in any way you can. And that's because at the top of the newel post, you see the fleur-de-lis? Yes. It's inverted, which is a huge insult.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. So we obviously want to point that out.
So they don't take offence.
Exactly, and they'll come back as friends. Now here on this drawing, you see the tower. This is our great room. The beams there are painted in the black and red ochre. Again, the fireplace, as big as it is, would have been much bigger. The pedestal at the bottom are beneath the floor. And this is why these doors are shortened.
It's a beautiful room.
Well, thank you. We had 2 concerts in here. We had a Steinway over there in the corner, and I guess we must have got just under 50 people in and went over 3 afternoons. We didn't have one this year because we're focusing all of our attention on creating this culture centre.
You'd have to rope off a walkway, wouldn't you? If you started to get significant numbers, you can't just wander around the rooms.
Oh, you can downstairs here. We get groups of 40, 50 people.
Are they all grown-ups?
Yeah. This is why I want to create the culture centre, you see, where we can replicate wall paintings over there. I want the kids to come in from school with their teachers. On one wall, we want to recreate the paintings, but the adjacent wall, we want to leave it bare, so that the kids can interact and partake. When they're gone, you just wipe it all off.
That's a brilliant idea.
Exactly. We don't just want kids coming, seeing and be bored. We want to engage with them. And if you know Marcus Binney, he had a huge influence on my life, Marcus. I used to read a lot of his architectural articles when I was very young, and I managed to get him here. He was, Save British Heritage. He started that. He was also one of the early editors for Country Life. When I got him here, he said, "Oh gosh, I should know this building. I should have known about it." And he was in the midst of writing that, and he said, "I shall put it to right," and he certainly did. No, a wonderful man, and really does champion buildings.
I'm Helen Anderson, and I'm here with Roger Sherlock, who is a tour guide at Ellys Manor House in Great Ponton. Roger, can you tell us a little bit about how your day normally goes?
Well, it usually means a large party of 20 to 40 people visiting the house, because only groups of 7 people at any one time can go upstairs to view the wall paintings. So a large party is one that is best split into 2 smaller groups, and while Clive takes half the party over to the house and in their turns they see the paintings, I take the other group over to the church. I talk about the family and why I think they were at Great Ponton and what their ideas were for developing the house, and then finally the church tower, and we have a close look at the church tower with all the references there are there to the Ellys family.
What's your favourite thing in the house? Have you got a favourite object?
Well, it would be the sitting room, the withdrawing room for the family when they no longer wish to be with their guests or whatever in the main hall.
How long have you been doing this?
4 years.
What drew you to Ellys Manor?
Well, I've always been interested since I was a boy in churches. In the very early days of coming to Lincolnshire in the 1970s, discovered the remarkable tower of Great Ponton Church, and then realised there was this also very unusual house next door. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would see the interior of that house, until 4 years ago I saw a very small advertisement at the back of the County News to say that the house was now open to the public. And my wife and I went for an afternoon's tour to see the house and to see the paintings. A tour of the house with Clive can take, as this did, if you show interest, it can take a couple of hours or more. And then in conversation with Clive and his wife Violet afterwards, they discovered that I'm a history graduate, that I've taught history for decades, and that I'm a tour guide at Lincoln Cathedral. Violet said, "Well, it's a shame you live so far away because we could use some additional help here." And I decided that it's not so far away, so since then, I've been assisting when there have been large parties.
How often do they open to the public?
He's open from Easter until the end of October, every day except Tuesday. But it's always wise to telephone in advance, because he may, if there's a large party for instance, he will have to close the house to casual visitors.
Does he get many organised tours?
We tend to get 2 or 3 a month in June, July, August.
What is the reason that you can't go upstairs in parties larger than 7?
Well, the paintings are very precious. They're also very fragile, so too many people in the room would disturb the humidity in the room, but also there's the risk that people's elbows or bags might scrape the walls, unintentionally obviously. Also, in terms of picking out the detail, it's worth being in a small group.
And how did you feel the first time you saw those paintings?
Like everybody is, I think, just amazed. They're very unusual in themselves, but such an array of them should have managed to survive. Tucked away, I was going to say tucked away in the Lincolnshire countryside, but it's right next to the A1, but nevertheless, Lincolnshire is not necessarily, a small Lincolnshire village isn't necessarily where you would expect to find such an amazing survival of very unusual art and very good art.
For somebody that hasn't been, can you tell us what the paintings are?
They are essentially a Renaissance theme, linked perhaps to fables. As you look at the paintings, you are looking through a kind of loggia, so an arcade of pillars and round arches have been painted on the wall, and you look through those arches, as it were, into some sort of garden behind, in which there are trees, triplicate trees, and an array of birds and animals. And there's no doubt a great deal more there to be found, because at the moment they are not fully restored. What's unusual is there is nothing religious about these paintings. So they date from the end of the 15th century, when it was still common to be painting the interiors of churches. These are secular. They're more than just a pattern. They are pictures. Yes, they are very much part of what Clive refers to as the Northern Renaissance.
So, Roger, how would you sum up Ellys Manor House historically?
Well, a few years ago, Dan Cruikshank, the architectural commentator and expert on a television series, visited a house in Wiltshire, slightly later than Ellys Manor House, and he described it as a gentry starter home. And for me, that's what Ellys Manor House is as well. The Ellises, Anthony and Thomas, were wool merchants based at Swineshead near Boston, but also merchants of the staple in Calais. And they were wanting to move away from trade and into land. So this is a gentry starter home, and they were starter gentry. When you visit the house, there are 6 features really that underline that purpose. They came to Great Ponton, I think, because it was where they had been buying wool. It's in the heart of what would have been a huge area of sheep production and wool production, the Lincolnshire Limestone Plateau, beyond which lie the Leicestershire and the Nottinghamshire wolds. And it's also conveniently placed in the fork between the old Ermine Street coming north from London and heading up to Lincoln on one side of the Witham Valley there, and then just behind the house the new road, which would eventually become the Great North Road, heading north to Newark and York. So they're going to move out of trade, but not all in one go. It's a sort of transitional thing. Anthony, it seems, was still largely based in Calais and developing the money side of the family's business. Thomas was probably the one who was based at Great Ponton and responsible for the house. And what they bought was a 14th century house. The evidence from what is left of the original kitchen block suggests there was a 14th century house with a hall. So for local people, that would have been a perfectly serviceable, relatively modern house. And who are these people? These people are wool merchants. And where have they come from? Swineshead. So here are these outsiders that have arrived in Great Ponton, and they've bought the house. And what are they going to do? They're going to knock it down. They knocked down all of the 14th century house apart from the kitchen block and built themselves a new house, this being at the end of the 15th century. And whereas the old house was aligned north-south, the new house was aligned east-west, so maximising the benefit of the sunshine throughout the day. That would have caused one stir, that these people have got so much money they can knock down a perfectly serviceable house. This new house, like the one it replaced, has a hall. But actually, this is what Clive often describes as a late medieval 2 up, 2 down. Because besides a great hall, they also built themselves a withdrawing chamber for the family and their private guests, and they repeated the pattern on the first floor with a large solar room and a private chamber for the family.
What do you mean by solar room?
Solar was the medieval sleeping quarters, so called because it was higher up in the house and therefore received the sun late in the day. So this kind of sophistication, not just one great hall where everything goes on, but 4 distinct rooms, this was the kind of sophisticated living that the aristocracy were developing now at the end of the 15th century as they moved out of their castles or modified their castles. But most local gentry and perhaps even aristocracy in West Lincolnshire would have only been able to dream of being able to have a house of this sort. And yet these are just wool merchants who are aspiring to that level of life. There are 4 rooms, so there are 4 fireplaces. This isn't a hall which is open to the rafters. There's a first floor, so there have to be 4 fireplaces, and there are 4 spectacular fireplaces in the house. Then we come to the fact that they chose to decorate the 2 rooms of the upper floor, the solar and the private chamber, with the wall paintings. And Clive always makes it clear that these wall paintings are not poor men's tapestries. If the Ellises had chosen to put tapestries in their first floor rooms, they had the money to do it. They probably put tapestries in their lower floor rooms. We don't know. There's no original plaster downstairs, so we do not know whether they painted the downstairs floors or not. But the upstairs floors have these very remarkable paintings. And then we come to the decision to place the crow-step gable on the end of the house that faces the street in the village. So the most important face of the house has the North European style crow-step gable, which eventually in the second half of the 16th century, 100 years later, and in the 17th century, this would become very fashionable. At the end of the 15th century, you probably have to go to London to find houses with a crow-step gable.
Can you explain what a crow-step gable looks like?
It simply means that instead of having a triangular gable to the end of your house, the 2 sides of the triangle on the base climb in a series of steps. And anybody that's been to Amsterdam or Bruges or almost any ancient town around the Baltic Sea would be familiar with that. This is what the Ellys brothers would have known from Calais. But as I say, this is very, very early for England, probably a first for Lincolnshire. Part of the idea of the crow-step gable is it gives the house a sense of height and dignity that doesn't really have. But you can also imagine the great and the good still using Ermine Street on the other side of the Witham Valley on their way to and from Lincoln, seeing the sun catch on this white limestone gable, and the question would come up, what is that over there? Oh, that's Ellis's new house. Leland said, "Oh, Ellys, he is much risen by trade." But the gable makes a statement about the house and about the Ellises. So they have their new house, they have their 4 rooms, they have their fireplaces, they have their paintings, they have their crow-step gable. And one can imagine Thomas and Anthony sitting down and feeling very pleased with their accomplishment and the stir that they have caused, and wondering whether there's anything more they can do to enhance their new estate. And perhaps looking out of the window at what was probably the sort of ubiquitous 13th, 14th century tower and spire on the medieval church a few hundred yards away, and saying, what a pity we've got such a mediocre medieval spire there next to our grand early Renaissance house. Now, the tower is, again, very, very unusual for Lincolnshire. There are some similar ones perhaps at Edenham and St John's in Stamford, but actually the real comparison with the Tower of Great Ponton Church, the real comparisons are to be found in Somerset, where Somerset wool and cloth merchants were rebuilding the towers of their medieval churches on the grand scale, late 15th, early 16th century. And I think perhaps that Anthony had colleagues in Calais who were from Somerset, that he may have gone and stayed with them, saw what they were building in Somerset, and said, yes, we're going to have one of those. As a result, Great Ponton has this magnificent tower, which is far too big for the rest of the church. It's really a sign, a symbol of their grateful piety, their thanks to God for their material success. It has the phrase on 3 sides of the tower, think and thank God of all. But it's also a monument to the earthly vanity of the Ellises.
I was actually going to ask you, do you think they'd got more money than sense, or were they buying favours into the church?
I'm sure more money than sense is what the locals said when they heard they were knocking the house down and making the other changes I've mentioned. As far as the tower is concerned, it is out of scale with the rest of the building. It is top heavy with its great battlemented parapet and 8 pinnacles. There are 2 image niches on 3 sides of the tower, which would be worthy of the west front of Lincoln Cathedral. They also, however, have their arms, their family hatchments, and those of the Calais stable on 3 sides. They have a whole frieze of merchant marks, and they also choose to put in royal coat of arms, especially a particularly elaborate one on the west tower, very visible from the Great North Road. Anybody travelling on the modern A1 up and down north and south. And so, yes, this is thanks to God for the success of the Ellises, but it's also saying, in true Renaissance style, yes, we are praying for our passage into the next life, but do remember who we were and what we achieved in this one. And the other feature of the tower are the 8 gargoyles, 8 very impressive gargoyles looking down, one of which is probably the earliest bespectacled gargoyle to be found anywhere in England. And this is on the south side of the tower, looking down on the house. And we are fairly certain that this is Thomas Ellis. The gargoyle is heavily bespectacled, and we know that Thomas had severe eyesight problems, which is probably why he was the house builder while Brother Anthony continued at Calais. And the gargoyle holds a book and a quill. So there is Thomas surveying his creation, looking down over Great Ponton.
Is the church open regularly, or does it kind of, you open it in conjunction with the tours?
We only get it open in conjunction with the tours, and it's a great responsibility. It's a small village which has a very large church. These days, particularly next to a busy road, a major road, it would be very difficult, I think, to get insurance to keep a church open during the day if people are not going to be present. So it is unlocked for us. The church warden unlocks it for us. It also contains evidence that there was a family chapel to the Ellises. The North Chapel, which became ruinous in the 18th or 19th century and was then, with the chancel, rebuilt but foreshortened, has evidence of perhaps Ellis tombs. The Ellis hatchments are to be found again built into the wall of that chapel.
What are hatchments?
They are like a coat of arms in that they have your family badge, but a coat of arms you need to have, to be called a coat of arms, you need to have a knighthood. So there is an Ellis coat of arms as well, but that wasn't granted until 1660. That relates to the Ellises who were by then at Nocton. And the Ellises at Nocton did to Nocton Hall what the Ellises of Swineshead did to Great Ponton. They knocked down Nocton Hall and built themselves a much grander mansion, which unfortunately burned down in the 19th century.
Do you know who actually built it?
No.
It must have taken a lot of people.
It's fairly clear that the paintings were painted by relatively local people, and the Ellises brought in pattern books and designs for them to work from. The church tower, there would have been the skills in Lincolnshire to build a tower like that. How they were persuaded, if they were local people, to use that design is difficult to know. So it is possible that a team of Somerset masons were brought in to build that tower as a one-off. The tower was completed in 1519, so the house is end of the 15th century. So there's a bit of a gap between finishing the house and then deciding to rebuild the church tower.
When they're trying to restore all the paintings on the wall, are they trying to use the original paints?
What you've got there is the partial removal of plaster. There's a lot more to come off, so if more of the plaster can be taken off without damaging the paintwork underneath, then there'll be far more original colour and far more detail to be seen. I don't imagine they're going to do an awful lot of touching up. The main idea will be to try and remove the surface layers and without damaging what's still there underneath.
That must be really quite tricky to do.
Which is why it's going to be so expensive.
Yeah. How long has it taken so far?
Well, all that you see there predates Clive. It was all done, I think, in the 1950s. And really very little has been done since. And what he wants to do is to raise the money to do the job thoroughly and properly and have them preserved for all time.
Now, just looking round your study, I can see that you are very passionate. The place is full of books. Well, how did you come to be so fascinated?
Age 11, I found myself with a gardening job, but I was not paid pocket money for the gardening job. At half terms and in school holidays, this gentleman who in effect became my mentor took me to places of historic interest. And since we're talking about growing up in Hampshire, this was Winchester Cathedral, Salisbury Cathedral. We'd also, because he was an East Anglian, we would also get to places like Colchester and Norwich and Cambridge. Almost every week we would be touring the lanes of North Hampshire and West Surrey and visiting village churches. History in school did not appeal to me, but the idea of walking into a church and putting your hand on a column built by the Normans, that suddenly brought it all alive. And from the churches, the interest in architecture expanded, so that for me now, as a historian, buildings are what really put us into the mind of people of another age. They tell us something about their values. So architecture and topography are very much my interest.
The late medieval wall paintings at Ellys Manor House are among the most beautiful of their period in the country. That the paintings survive at all can be seen as miraculous, as in the 1940s, when the house was a rectory, the walls of the house were reported as running with water and that puddles were forming on the floor. When the incumbent complained about this to his superiors, no solution to the problem was suggested, other than that the rector instructed his wife to mop up the puddles with a cloth. I'm with Clive Taylor, the current owner of Ellys Manor House, as we continue our tour. We're going upstairs now to see the medieval wall paintings.
This is a sword step. It's 2 inches higher than all the others.
Oh!
To trip you up.
Well, it worked.
Oh, right. You know, the stairs bend to the right, so it means we're still in defensive mode.
Why did they try and trip you up?
Because if the laird was being pursued, you'd dash up the stairs knowing that you'd trip on that step and he'd turn with his sword and do the deed.
So where are we now?
We're now in the painted chamber. Well, basically, the whole of the upper floor. These wall paintings run around.
And do you know how old these are?
Well, we're reliably told now that these are circa 1500. Well, first we have to remember it was Edward VI, no graven images, when these were all whitewashed over. They say all the churches in the land were painted. What makes these so special, though, and people said, well, why were they painted over? And I don't know, but these are domestic, not ecclesiastical. Now, when Pevsner came here, these were found in late 1930s. And when he came, he said these were the things to be seen in Lincolnshire. He likened them to an English interpretation of French verdure tapestries done on the walls. Now, the word verdure tells you the heads of the trees were green, very green. But green and blue are two of the weakest of the earth pigments, whereas red is incredibly strong. It's always the last to go. These have never been properly restored or conserved, I should say, by true professionals. First, Professor Tristram was brought in. And see this little square? This is all they'd uncovered, which was on the glass. Notice the discoloration? They made their biggest mistake here. They waxed it. That's an absolute no-no. Then they thought it protected it. It needs to breathe. When they continued with the cleaning, Clive Rouse, who is the man, he is the author of these books, also gained an MB for his work. Everywhere you see wall paintings, Rouse had something to do with it. Water used to run down these walls. These were miraculous survival. There are places you see, it's not actually gone. It's lime wash waiting to be properly uncovered. Now, we brought in a chap from the Courtauld, again one of the finest in the land. He's carried out a complete survey. So if we're able to raise over £150,000, he and his students will have over 500 hours of work professionally uncovering these.
There's more to be uncovered.
Oh gosh, yes. You see places like this. If you look closely, it's like a slurry. They've started the work, but you can see the acanthus beneath it. When that is properly cleaned, you will get more clarity. You see that wall across there. You see the top section. That's not badly uncovered. But at the bottom, That's not lost, that's lime wash to be uncovered.
It'll be magnificent when it's all uncovered.
Oh, we owe this. There is not another like this. These were found in end of 1930, and still today they're considered the most important and extensive domestic work of this period. Though it's domestic, it is still symbolic.
This is a very expensive way of getting your bedroom decorated, isn't it?
Well, yes, but this also shows us, again, another piece of social history. Previous to this, what you had were nobles travelling from one coal castle to another, rather like a caravan with their tapestries, for warmth and comfort. Now we're, starting to see the new middle classes, merchants, burghers, whatever. But what they're showing us is a change of life. They live, they go away to work, they're seeing things and they're bringing it back. And don't forget, they were cash rich.
Are there any records to show who the artists were or how much they were paid?
No, sadly. Even these Tudor beams coming down, you just see the faint reddening. But you see, before we came, no one blotted out the ultraviolet rays from the windows, and the building was 90% damp. We had to put in a complete damp-proof course and treated all these timbers for death watch beetles. Took the building nearly 3 years to dry out.
Did you live in it while that was being done?
We moved out at one stage because when we could no longer smell the spray which had been used for the death watch, but the moment you lit a naked flame, your eyes would stream. So we then left it for a while longer. Here you see the bottom of a shield, and it's blue. This is nicely uncovered, but halfway down you can clearly see there's a lot of lime wash to be removed. Now the window was made larger at some point and very poorly done. Now on this wall, see the tree trunks, always in threes, Trinity. See the gold on the inside. As we move up to the top by the window, that's the best of the shields. It is pre-Reformation, so there's every chance it's papacy. See the columns. Now, actually, what they're trying to do here is to give you the idea that you're within the room, looking out of a loggia. There are columns every 7 feet apart. They go all the way around the room. And the frieze would have gone all the way around, sitting on the columns. Then the columns are standing on the dado. You're within the room, looking through those openings. This is pure pleasure.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. But you see, in the Victorian times, they took out chunks of plaster around doors and windows. But in high-status houses, they plastered right up to the edge. See the beautiful deer? That really draws you in. That's not badly uncovered. But below it, you see there's lots to be uncovered. But when we get to this column, you see the peacock? Now, the peacock is the symbol of longevity.
What is that rectangle there?
This chap got in touch with us maybe 4 years ago now. He found us on the web. And I'm glad you brought that up because he should be mentioned. Aidan Bell. And in his own words, he said, I'm the little that scratched the wall and got a good thrashing. But it led them to finding the wall paintings. He was one of the early rector's sons. So we invited him to come and spend a day with us. He hadn't been back to the house for nearly 70 years. He'd become an engineer working mainly in Africa. He said it's the only place he ever thought of as home. And we now keep him in touch with what we're doing. He's a lovely man. So that's him pointing to where he did his deed as a child.
What was he doing? Graffiti?
Well, he did just scratching away at plaster, and they saw colour and led them to realize what was there. As we come across to here, do you see the brush of the tail, sway of the back?
Oh, yes.
That's Reynard the fox. And if you look closely, you'll see the mouth is open, and there's a crane's beak going into the mouth. So you're looking at one of Aesop's fables.
Yes.
It's where the fox is gorging itself on meat. A bone gets lodged in its throat. The bird with the surgical light beak offers to assist, does so successfully, and then asks to be recompensed. He looks at her and he says, but you've had your head down my throat and you're still alive. Is that not enough? It's rather like you going to your bank manager and him saying to you, but we look after your money so well. Do you want interest too?
Yes.
But
That's quite appropriate today.
Yeah, and here we see a modern sculpture of that. That's in Berlin, outside of Tetra Park.
Now, I noticed this one's called the Wolf and the Crane.
And very wisely too. In various European countries, they use, it could be a wolf or a fox, because we've got the influence from France. Reynard was the first fixture of Europe. We've gone, sometimes also it could be a crane or a heron, depending on where the influence is coming from. But it is the same story. Now also, because it's coming from the Greek, it needed to be translated. So here we can see it's being translated by a Flemish priest, because they knew also, this being Caxton's body of work, Caxton lived in Bruges or Ghent, they're not sure which. But when he was ready to start the printing press in London, he couldn't find an Englishman to help him. So he brought over a Fleming, Wynkyn de Worde. When the printing press was being laid out, they wanted it to also look aesthetically correct. But they were not academics, they were businessmen. And you know, the English language was going through a time when the French had a say on it as well. So it was moving about with different influences. That's why we have all this peculiarity in English spelling. So within this house, what it's evoking is the whole of this European thing going on, and we have it right here between these walls. Beneath here there's more waiting to be uncovered. And all of this would have been the solar. This would have been the most important room, because there were no corridors, but you had privacy from the four-poster bed with curtains. You would have been a privileged person to be received in the solar. The paintings ran all the way around, the columns. These are hunting dogs. Now this one, even though the tincture is no longer, you see the outline quite clearly. So they were semi-rampant on either side of the trees. And then the head of the tree there, you see the reds, fruit and catkins dotted around the head of the tree. Very pleasurable. It's breathtaking. And again you see a heavy dose of acanthus. Absolutely every inch of the place was painted. And it continues all along. Now mind this little step up here. Here there are two lions on either side of trees again. That's the best of the two. See the tail curling over. This one you only see the hind quarters. When all this blue is removed, then you will see.
It is still preserved underneath.
Oh yes, indeed.
It's marvellous that so much of it is still there to
survives,
find.
yeah.
Our thanks go to Clive Taylor, Roger Sherlock, Helen Anderson, Ian Hensel and Ella Watts.
The local history feature is brought to you by Gravity FM in association with Your Heritage, awarding funds from the National Lottery. See www.hlf.org.uk.